Greetings, everyone. A military scenario once thought impossible has just been brutally realized on the southern battlefield in the Crimean Peninsula. In just 48 short hours, a series of precise, continuous firepower operations completely broke the enemy's logistical backbone, dramatically shifting the geopolitical landscape. And here are the main points in the video. Red alert: 6 Crimean bridges have collapsed, and 110,000 Russian troops are trapped in a terrifying ring of fire. In just 48 hours, 6 strategic bridges connecting the mainland to the Crimean Peninsula were completely destroyed by Ukrainian firepower in an unbelievable scenario. Breaking through the Panzer S-1 fire net by the Ukrainian stealth squadron. Russian heavy armored reinforcement convoys became exposed prey, waiting to die right in front of the front lines. Russia is forced to confront the ocean monsters, and Crimea is pushed into isolation. The deadly Perekop Isthmus is under fire blockade and has turned into a natural death trap. Russia is forced to confront the ocean monsters Sibibe and Maguza in 5 areas of the Black Sea. Here is the content and detailed analysis. 6 Crimean bridges have collapsed, 1 bridge is exhausted, and 110,000 Russian troops are trapped. Ladies and gentlemen, the situation on the southern front line and the Crimean Peninsula has just witnessed a shocking military turning point, where the Ukrainian armed forces have realized a scenario that once seemed impossible from a tactical perspective. In a large-scale infrastructure neutralization campaign calculated to be extremely devastating, Kiev's strike forces delivered lightning blows to 2 key transportation arteries, the Chonha Bridge and the Henniches Bridge, on June 9 and 10. Not stopping there, June 11 continued to see 4 more strategic bridges along the Amiens and Perekop defensive lines completely destroyed. 6 critically important targets were paralyzed in just 48 short hours, turning the entire transportation system connecting this peninsula to the southern fronts into cut-off routes, completely freezing the flow of Russian military reinforcements. All efforts to transport fuel, ammunition, and military equipment through these economic and military corridors have now become a risky gamble and almost impossible as the lifelines have been cut. Through a highly coordinated and rare campaign in the history of modern warfare, Ukraine proactively severed this last line of communication, carrying out the plan to completely isolate the Crimean Peninsula from the mainland. Open intelligence data paints an extremely bleak and tragic picture for the Kremlin. About 50,000 Russian troops are stretched thin on the southern Ukrainian battlefield, along with more than 600,000 soldiers stationed in Crimea, are falling into a situation where they have lost a solid logistical support base. Kiev's bold and cold-blooded decision has put a total of more than 110,000 enemy troops into a giant trap, a true ring of fire. This achievement did not come from luck, but is the result of a military geometry calculation by Ukraine that is precise down to every detail. This cunning geographical calculation is evident as the targets are only about 50 to 70 kilometers apart, creating ideal conditions for a series of pincer attacks to suffocate the defensive line. Ukraine's tactical intention was deployed like a game of Go that had been arranged in advance to force the opponent into exposing themselves. First, they struck a lightning blow at the Key Bridge right at dawn, following up on a previous attempt to destroy it just a few days earlier, forcing Russian vehicles to look for evacuation routes. When Russia's massive supply convoys crowded onto the alternative route through the Arabat Spit to cross the strait via the Henniches Bridge, the very next morning, that bridge was also blown up by precisely targeted fire. These devastating coordinated attacks culminated in the simultaneous destruction of 4 bridges along the Amyarsk-Perekov route the next day, sealing the operational pocket and trapping the remaining Russian forces in complete isolation. Kiev's strategy, though simple in theory, was to strike, force the enemy onto a backup route, and then destroy that route. The real-world impact of this tactical system over the last 2 days has been a logistical nightmare. That Russia allowed this raises a pressing question for Moscow's military leadership. The selection of this crucial strategic target required the involvement of Kiev's most elite and well-trained forces to realize an ambitious military objective. The Phi Lan Multi-Domain Operations Center and the 475th Independent Assault Brigade, famous for their combat codename 9.2, closely coordinated to devise a historic synchronized action plan. On the ground, the direct coordination of the operation was entrusted to the seasoned, experienced warriors of the 1st Independent Assault Brigade, named after the legendary commander Dmitry Koshubalo. The weapon chosen for this decisive battle was the new generation of FPV suicide drones, developed independently by Ukraine, which secretly approached targets by flying below the sweep of Russian air defense fire. By the time Russian sensors and surveillance systems detected this deadly threat, it was already too late. A rapid series of violent explosions caused the structures to collapse into irreparable rubble. In the midst of the crisis, Russian military engineers immediately set up a temporary pontoon bridge right next to the old structure. However, this makeshift structure was far too fragile to withstand the weather, storms, and heavy equipment like main battle tanks. The ineffectiveness of this temporary solution reflects a bitter reality for Mr. Putin's military on the battlefield. The destruction of the Chonha Bridge has paralyzed the Russian army's logistics in the southern battlefield. The main units, typically the 37th Mechanized Infantry Brigade, which relied entirely on this lifeline to maintain their combat strength, suddenly had their supply lines cut off. Not only the armored brigades, but even the Russian military police forces responsible for maintaining order in the controlled areas also fell into a severe fuel crisis. In particular, the logistics system along the coast of the Sea of Azov suddenly had to shoulder the entire burden of supply after the land routes were cut off, pushing the transport capacity here to the brink of total collapse. Destroying the Hennessys and Chonha bridges forced the Russian army into a long stalemate. Now, Russian military convoys can no longer freely enter the southern battlefield as before, since Ukraine's unmanned firepower has cast a shadow and put this entire route under threat. The loss of these two key bridges has made nighttime supply operations nearly impossible, as most of the connection points have been wiped out. Facing the living hell on the southern front, the only remaining escape route is the narrow strip of land passing through the Perekop-Amiens corridor. This narrow corridor, about 100 to 150 kilometers long, has become the last lifeline for 50,000 Russian troops in southern Ukraine and 600,000 stationed in Crimea. This strip of land is actually a deadly trap, where any attempt to move large-scale forces becomes impossible. However, even the last escape route that the Russian army tried to protect at all costs has been tightly sealed by the latest attacks. The Ukrainian armed forces did not overlook this strategic choke point, delivering a highly precise, large-scale coordinated strike on the last remaining corridor. Waves of intense firepower continued for hours through the night. Despite Russian air defense systems working at full capacity to intercept, Ukraine's FVV suicide drone squadrons still managed to slip through the gaps in radar coverage to reach their targets. The attack points were not chosen at random, but were ruthlessly selected, forcing Russian regional official Vladimir Sandoz to bitterly confirm the situation. The first targets to be struck were two vital bridges spanning the North Zamir Canal near Vypyosan and Maidan Maizon, which are the main supply routes from the direction of Amiens into the peninsula. Immediately after that, the main road bridge on the Perikosh-Amiens axis, which directly connects to the M17 highway, specialized for heavy military convoys, tanks, and fuel tankers, was also destroyed. The final barrage locked down the rear at the auxiliary bridge near the Stavki residential area, which was originally used as a backup route in case of congestion. Thus, in just a few short days, along with the Chonha and Hennessys bridges, the four bridges in the Amiens area that were destroyed has brought the total number of disabled targets in the approaches in northern Zamir to 6. Now, the Zamir Peninsula is being pushed into an almost complete state of isolation in terms of military logistics. All of the Russian military's lifelines here are now forced to rely entirely on the Kerch Bridge and an overloaded ferry system, a choice that is nothing short of suicidal, given that the waters of the Black Sea are dominated by Ukraine's unmanned boat squadrons. Ocean terrors like Sea Baby or Magura V5 have long been a constant nightmare for the Russian Navy, and it is these high-speed suicide boats carrying massive amounts of explosives that are responsible for the attacks that have crippled and permanently reduced the load-bearing capacity of the Kerch Bridge in 2023 and 2024. Kyiv's strategy appears simple, but it's ruthless. They repeatedly strike at the main supply lines to force Russian logistics convoys onto a backup route, then immediately move to break that escape route as well, before locking down every remaining path. In just 48 hours, this perfect trap operated with astonishing precision, raising a bitterly serious question about the security capabilities of the bridge. The Russian army's predicament on the southern front can be considered to have entered its final chapter right at the Hedeshet Bridge, the structure that directly connects the mainland with the narrow strip of Azabat land. For the Russian command, this is not simply an inert block of concrete, but a strategic backdoor, a vital backup lifeline that keeps the entire southern front alive when the main routes are blocked. All emergency evacuation and resupply plans of the Russian generals are designed around this core axis. However, the fall of Hediket was determined by a precisely executed intelligence operation down to the smallest detail by Ukraine's long-range drone units. For many weeks before the battle, Kyiv's Special Operations Forces used satellites to record every patrol schedule and pattern of guard changes of the stationed troops without missing a single detail. All data on the Russian decoy network, electronic warfare stations, and air defense grid in the area was thoroughly analyzed around the clock. Even the blind spots in the Panzer S air defense missile and artillery launch system, which protected the bridge, were precisely located, creating a completely invisible flight corridor for attacking vehicles. When the time was right, a wave of firepower combining suicide drones and precision-guided weapons struck directly at the most vulnerable points in the bridge's load-bearing structure. The violent shockwaves not only shattered the supporting pillars, but also delivered a decisive blow, causing permanent damage and officially removing the Azabat Strait defense line from the strategic logistics map. But that physical shock was just the tip of a dark and ominous iceberg. The destruction of the Heniket Bridge immediately set off a disastrous chain reaction for Russian frontline forces. The massive convoys carrying BM-21 Grad multiple rocket launchers and S-300 air defense missiles, which were eagerly heading to the front lines, suddenly became exposed targets right in front of the destroyed bridge. Russia's strategic defensive positions towards Zaporizhia from this point. Kherson was fully cut off from the regular ammunition supply coming from the Crimean Peninsula. In the blazing trenches, Russian infantry forces, who had been straining themselves to repel the advances of the Ukrainian National Guard, now found themselves powerless. All the desperate cries for artillery support were now just hopeless sounds over the radio. At the fortified positions around Melitopol and Tokmak, Russian soldiers suddenly realized they were trapped in a suffocating bottleneck as the essential fuel supply for tanks and artillery positions was abruptly cut off. Instead of the previously short and safe routes, ammunition trucks and supply vehicles were now forced to take winding, distant, and dangerous roads under Ukraine's tight surveillance and heavy firepower, leaving Russian troops facing an extremely bleak future. As an inevitable consequence, the disabling of strategic bridges like Henichis and Chonha pushed the Russian army into the most precarious position they had faced during a long period of combat operations. Russia's massive military convoys could no longer move in and out of the southern front at will, because Ukraine's drone network had put all these routes under constant fire, turning them into deadly kill zones. When the vital connection points were eliminated, nighttime supply operations, which had been a lifeline hidden under the cover of darkness, also became an impossible mission for the Russian army. By cutting off all the ground supply routes leading into Crimea, the Ukrainian army is recreating a similar large-scale scenario of strangling the enemy's logistics. So, what tactical advantages will the Ukrainian armed forces gain on the front lines after successfully disabling these 6 bridges? This strategic choke point could completely reshape the war's geopolitical landscape. The destruction of these 6 vital bridges has given Kyiv a decisive victory on the battlefield. It completely crippled the mobility of Russian armored brigades, thereby eliminating any possibility of a counteroffensive from Moscow. The initiative on the Zaporozhye and Kherson fronts is now shifting entirely into the hands of Ukraine's assault units. Due to the severe shortage of ammunition, Russian artillery positions on the front lines will certainly see a significant decrease in firepower density, creating safer corridors for Ukrainian infantry and mechanized brigades to advance and capture positions. At the same time, Ukraine's push toward the strategic city of Melitopol can now advance more effectively, decisively, and with clearer results than ever before. The Ukrainian National Guard also faces a great opportunity to launch operations to sweep out remaining enemy forces on the southern front, as Russian defensive lines, already lacking logistical support, are becoming weaker and more vulnerable with each passing day. Kyiv has officially taken hold of the key position to steer the course of the conflict in its favor. From a different angle, after a long period of safety, the Crimean Peninsula is now directly targeted by the Ukrainian military with tangible objectives. The physical weakening of the fortified southern land corridor is opening up new operational routes for Ukrainian special forces, when Kyiv is no longer just putting pressure on the front lines, but is meticulously cutting off each lifeline and artery right in the opponent's own backyard. Currently, the Ukrainian General Staff is facing two strategic choices, and both are absolute nightmares for the Russian military. The first option is to establish a comprehensive land corridor through a full-scale frontal assault on the Arikov Isthmus using traditional infantry tactics. In theory, this option is entirely feasible, but in reality, it comes at a very high cost and carries enormous risks because the Arikov choke point, which is only 5 to 7 kilometers wide, is a deadly trap filled with dense minefields. To break through this defensive line, Ukraine would have to organize large-scale crossings of the Dnipro River or launch a massive mechanized assault from the south towards Zaporizhia, a campaign that would risk the lives of tens of thousands of soldiers and face heavy losses under Russia's dense air defense fire. Therefore, the Ukrainian General Staff may temporarily put this option on hold as a backup plan. The second approach, which is much more practical and feasible, is the strategy of isolating enemy logistics combined with sustained firepower pressure, something the Ukrainian military is implementing very effectively. This approach allows Zemir to be neutralized from the road network without having to pay the price of a bloody assault. If Ukraine takes this strategy a step further, they could establish absolute firepower control around the Perekop area. That means without having to completely destroy the physical structure of the passage, they can still maintain continuous firepower pressure, burning down any military movement attempts through this isthmus. Kyiv didn't just destroy 6 bridges, they brought the flames of war right up to the doorstep of Crimea, knowing the escape routes of Russian forces across the entire front, signaling a completely changed situation in the coming days. This war started in Crimea and will very likely end in Crimea as well. So, in your opinion, what happens next to rescue more than 110,000 troops who are being trapped before it's too late?